yourself as you operate the computer. Okay, so what we have here is a graphical. So this is an IDE that lives inside your browser that lets you explore the data that is being served by a GraphQL server. And so in this case, this is the Star Wars API. So this exposes a bunch of information about Star Wars. And so I can run this query, and we can see that we've requested all films and the edges and nodes, which is kind of graph terminology, which makes sense in GraphQL, and then the titles of those films. And we can see that we get New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, etc., etc. And apparently, there are no new films. I don't know how, if Disney would approve of this API, but we're all good. So what we've got here is the essence of GraphQL. Now, where it gets kind of interesting is if you're thinking about developing an application, like this is all good and well, right? But this is something that you can do with REST. Let's say that we want to know, we want to have a UI that presents the planets that you visited on each of these films. So we can just go in here and we can say planet connection, and then we can say edges. Cool. Gonna make that look pretty. And we can run this query, and then now we can see that for A New Hope we visited Tatooine and Alderaan and a whole suite of other planets. Some of them we apparently visited twice. So this is pretty cool. So it means that as your application changes and what you need to power your application changes, you can simply run a different query and you'll get exactly what you need. There's also some nice affordances for altering what kind of comes back. You might say in your application, well, we just want to show kind of a summary of the planets that we've visited. So we can say, we just want to look at the first 3 planets. And we'll run that query. And now we can see that for each of these films, we're just fetching 3 planets back. So this is pretty cool. You can very quickly change what you're fetching. Now you would have noticed that as I was typing, I've got type ahead and auto for fields that I could fetch. And this is not kind of an external tool. This is actually built into GraphQL, so it has an introspection ability. So I can request a special field called type name. And then if I execute this, I can see that each of these objects that I'm getting back are actually planet types. So GraphQL is strongly typed. And then I can actually take this a step further and I can request information about that type. I apologize if I mistype, because I'm not a great touch typer, especially when I'm in front of an audience. All right, so what we've requested here is introspection, so some metadata about the planet type. And I've requested the fields, and we can see that planets have a name, they have a diameter, a rotation period, etc., etc. So this is a really good way to find out about any GraphQL server that's out there, or any GraphQL schema. You have this information. And of course, you don't want to develop like this, like writing these queries is pretty painful. So we have this little docs panel, which exposes the same metadata in a much nicer interface. So I can type in planet, and you just click on the planet, and then we'll see all of the information that the API is exposing about that type. So this is a really great way to develop. Like you're getting all of this information, even if you didn't know about this domain or you hadn't worked on this code base before. You can imagine like just seeing graphical and being able to explore that code base and get what you need. All right, so that's GraphQL. It's a really good way to get data from your server to your client. And the second technology I'm going to talk about today is Relay. And this is about how we know which queries that we will actually need to execute. Like we want to write very complex queries. How do we have some tools to compose them in a good way? And then how do we manage the data once it gets to the client? So Relay is a framework for React applications. So important thing here is React. If you're using Angular or Ember, at the moment Relay is probably not going to be super useful to you. And Relay is not the only way of fetching GraphQL data from JavaScript applications. There's a whole spectrum of different technologies. So on the very simple and unopinionated end, you have things like Loca, which is just a library. And you can say, here's a query, go and execute it against the server, and then it will just give you the JSON blob of data back. So very simple, you can plug it into any application, it's going to work really well. On the other end of the spectrum, you have things like Apollo, which is the Meteor project. Has anyone heard of Apollo or used it? Cool, okay, so people are using that too. And then you have Relay. And so they're fairly similar in what they offer. Apollo is probably on the easier to learn end of the spectrum, and Relay is like super opinionated, but there's good reasons, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So when you're writing a Relay application, essentially you'll have React components that declare the queries for the data that they need. Relay is then going to manage the fetching of that data from the server for you and do it in the most efficient way. And then Relay is going to do some nice things around common design patterns. So if you can think of things like pagination, where you might, for example, with the planets that we saw before, you saw 3 planets, and if you decided all of a sudden, okay, when they hit a more button, we want to show them 6, Relay can do efficient fetches, so it can know what you've fetched in the past, and then just fetch the new data. So it'll say, I'm going to go and fetch planets 4, 5, and 6 for you, and not refetch planets 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to show you some code again today, if I can Alt-tab across to my IDE. And it's going to be for this application. So this is a news aggregator style application. It's very simple. I've got the code for this. It's up on GitHub, so I'll share a link at the end of this talk. Doesn't do anything too interesting, and the data is just in memory in the server, but you can plug it into a server database very easily. Now, given that this is a React application, we have a structure that looks kind of like this. So we have an application component that composes a feed component and then a set of story components, and each of those stories has a like button and an author. Now, given that this is a Relay application, we need to add a little query annotation to each of those components. So it says which fields we need to render something to the screen. So for a story, you can imagine we ask for the title and maybe the link and how many times it's been liked. And for the author, we ask for the author's name. So that's pretty straightforward. And then at the top, we have a higher order component that will kind of take all of these different queries and merge them all into one query that can be sent to the server. This will interact with a local cache. So if you've used Redux or Flux, this is kind of like your in-memory store of all of the data you've fetched already. And that's going to interact with the server, so the GraphQL server. Now, this is very similar to what you have with something like Redux, except for the little annotations that you add to every React component. And so why do you need to do that? A lot of people think that your data fetching should be very separate from your render code. And we refer to this co-location, or putting the queries next to the React components, as query co-location. And native apps originally that were using GraphQL at Facebook, they didn't do this. So if you had an iOS application talking to GraphQL, you'd have a giant GraphQL query that might say, describe all of the data you need to render something like the news feed. And over, on another part of your application, you'd have all of your render code. And it became really hard to understand, this massive query, why it was fetching all of this data. If you, had a question about, do we actually need this field? You'd have to kind of trace through all of the control flow of your application to answer that question. But with co-location, when the query is defined next to the render code, exactly where it's being used in the same file, it's a very easy question to answer. You just kind of scroll up a few lines and you go, oh, it's being used here on this button, therefore we obviously need it. And Relay actually goes one step further, and it actually enforces that you can't look at data you didn't explicitly say that you needed. So even if you're fetching the user's name in one component, you can't use that data in another component unless that component is also saying that it needs to know that data. So it's a really nice way of enforcing that you're not going to break your application when something else changes later on. So I'm going to show you some query now, and this is going to be composing and executing queries. And I'm actually going to move around. That makes a lot of sense. So this way I'm not looking at the wrong thing. So I'm going to firstly show you, let's see my mouse. There it is. Cool. So this is the application that we're looking at now. So we can see that we've got the first 3 stories here. And now I have to go and rescue my IDE. Bring it across. There we go. So if we look at the code that's rendering this, this is the component that renders a story. And so what we've got here is a pretty typical React component. It's accepting a story property right at the top here. It's using that story object to render some data. And we can also see that we have this like HTML-like syntax. This is JSX. It's specific to React. And hopefully a lot of you have seen this before, so that I don't have to kind of explain the syntax. If we scroll down, this is where we get to the Relay-specific stuff. And the syntax here is totally ugly. You're not wrong if you're thinking about all of these weird arrow functions and all this kind of stuff. don't worry too much about that because this is all kind of in flux for the Relay API, and so it will be changing. What's important is this GraphQL query here. And so this is where we're declaring what we need to know to render a story. And you'll notice at the top that it says fragment on story. So story is the type. And when we're saying it's a fragment, this is saying it's kind of like a query, but it's a query that you can't execute in isolation. So we can't just go to the server and tell me the title of the story, because it's going to be like, I don't know what story you're talking about. So you need to kind of embed this in another query for it to have it work. And if we go down a little bit, we actually see where we're doing this for the author component. So what we're saying is we're composing the author component up here. So each story has an author. So we need some data to pass into it. And so we're saying, well, when we fetch data, let's make sure that we also fetch the author component's data. And if we jump across into the author component, we'll see that it's just fetching the name of the user. So this is essentially the same as saying something like name here. It'll just be composed together by the Relay framework. All right, so let's have a look at this running in the browser now. So if I open up the inspector, and given that this is a terrible resolution, we're going to have fun fitting things in. I'm on the network tab here, so I'm going to refresh the page and we'll see what Relay actually sent out. So you might have expected that you get a single GraphQL segment based on everything I've said, but that was a lie because we actually got two. What Relay's realized is that we were fetching the username up here, and it's realized that it can actually execute this without having to fetch anything else on the page, so it's gone and done that for us. So that maybe if you want to render the header as soon as that comes back, you might get that on the screen a couple of hundred milliseconds earlier. The second query that we have is the main query that's fetching the feed data. So we can see it's fetching the feed, it's got the stories inside there, and we've got the title, the comment count, the like count, all of this kind of stuff, and the author name way down in there. So Relay has taken all of those fragments to find out all of my different components, there's about 5 or 6 of them, and turned it into one giant query to send to the server for me. So I didn't have to worry about how things kind of fit together. It's kind of done that part for me. It's partly convention and partly smarts in the internals. I'm going to show you some of the generated output from Babel now, which is always fun to look at. So if you've worked in the kind of Webpack ecospace and used Babel before, you'll know that what you write in your code doesn't ever translate. Oops, salty. That's not a real thing. Doesn't ever translate into what you get in the browser. So with that JSX code, that HTML code I showed you before, Babel has transformed that into a bunch of function calls. So we can see it's React create element calls. And if I scroll down a little bit, I can probably get rid of my console. We'll see that it's actually done a similar thing to my GraphQL query. So that text query that we had here has been transformed into a set of properties on an object. So we see that we're actually fetching the title, and Relay has actually annotated this with some extra metadata that we didn't have before. So it's actually told us that the title is always going to be a string, and the comment count is going to be an integer. And when we get down into the author field, which we have here, this monstrosity is actually embedding the information that the author component needed. But there's something else that's interesting here is that it's actually fetched an ID. And so this actually wasn't part of this component. So we never actually specifically asked for the ID. Relay has gone and fetched it, and it's actually said it's a generated field. The developer didn't ask for it, Relay asked for it. And the reason it does this is that Relay will take all of the data that you get back, and it will normalize it. So it will take all of the author objects and take all of the story objects and store them in kind of lists. And then it needs to do this bookkeeping so that if you ever update a story, it needs to know what it needs to pass to its child, being the author component. And it uses the ID to do this. So you don't have to worry too much about the specifics, but the nice takeaway is that Relay will manage your data for you and manage the normalization and then the subscriptions on the header for you. And it will also ask for all of the information and the metadata it needs to successfully do that. And so as a developer, you just have to say, well, I just define what I want and it works. You don't have to worry too much about the mechanics of how that works. I want to show you now what it's like to actually do a little bit of development using Relay. So I can close this down a little bit. And I've got the author name here, but I actually want to show a profile picture next to the author. So I'm going to add that in now, and we'll see how many lines of code it takes to do. So I've got another graphical instance, and this is actually pointing to my local server. And I'll just expand the docs here, and we can see that we've got, we can kind of explore our schema. And I know that the author is using the user object. Just by clicking through, I can kind of see that authors have a name, sorry, users have a name, and they also have an image property. So I'm going to use this and add this in, and jump into my author component. So I'm going to fetch my image here, and then I'm going to use that up here. So I'm going to go image source equals with user. I'm going to add a class name, because otherwise it will look terrible. And if I go to my Relay instance, we have an error because I mistyped. All right, bonus points to anyone who tells me what I did wrong.
Last name minus.
Look at that. Thank you. He's not valid syntax, is it? All right. So it's auto hot reloaded here, and we can see that it's actually pulled in the image based on those props. And so I want to call out what I actually changed here. So literally these 2 lines of code. And I actually think this is pretty awesome, right? I didn't have to go into a Redux reducer or an action dispatcher or anything like that and kind of modify all my fetch statements or go in and modify my API endpoints. I literally had to add 2 lines of code into my application, and now it starts doing what I wanted. And this becomes a lot more interesting when you consider that, like, the author component, maybe it exists in a component library somewhere, and I'm using this in 100 different locations in my application. Well, all of those are going to continue to work because Relay is going to do the query composition for all of those call sites. So, you know, we don't have to worry about, did I break something by modifying one of my core components, because we've coupled the data fetching and the rendering in the same place. So I think that's pretty awesome. Not everyone thinks data fetching is awesome, but I happen to. All right, so if you've ever developed an application, you know that there's more to that than having a static view, because what we literally have is something I can reload and it will show me some data. We could actually build that in PHP or in Ruby or anything like that. We want to have an interactive application, and Relay has some more affordances for doing that. One is query params. And I kind of showed you one of these before. When I was fetching the planets and I said I wanted only 3, I was using a param to do that. And the other is mutations. And mutations are where you modify the underlying data as it exists on the server. And so an example of that will be a like count. When I say I want to like something, it's always going to increase that by 1. So I'm going to show you how that works now. And so if I go to my feed component, we'll see again that we have a React component that's just taking a set of stories, mapping over them, and producing a story component. And when I'm fetching the data, I'm saying I want to fetch the first 3 stories. So firstly, let's try changing that value and seeing what happens. If we, no, not save, that would help. If we let this hot reload, very slowly hot reload, not at all. What did I do?
Not saved. Not saved.
I'm not on a Mac, that's why. It's the worst thing ever. Don't have a Windows PC at home and a Mac at work, because all of your muscle memory goes away. All right, so we've got 6 stories now because we changed that. But we obviously don't want to be changing our code and shipping a new version every time we change what we want to look at. So I'm going to make this a variable that Relay can understand at runtime, and I'm going to call it count. And I need to give this an initial value. Save that and go back to our browser. And now we've got 3 again. And I should have actually finished that before I alt-tabbed to back. But we've got the initial variable of 3, and now we need to modify this at runtime. And so Relay gives me a property that I can use to do that. Any guesses as to what it might be called? Anyway, what's that? Query params? No, it's called Relay. Very creative. And so it's got some functions on it that I can use to modify the variables. And if you've used set state in React, then this should feel fairly familiar to you. We're setting a variable, and we're saying we want it to be the current value, and I'll use the Relay variables again. We want to set it to the current value plus 3. So I'm going to save this and Alt-Tab. All right, so now when I click on Load More, we're now fetching more items. And I'm going to show you what is happening in the network panel here. So we fetched more items, but what happened is that I went from saying first 3 to first 6. So what you might expect is that that's the query that you send to the server, and that's the result you get back. But like I said a little bit earlier, and my windows are getting a little smaller and smaller, so I apologize for it's like looking through a postage stamp, isn't it?
Control minus.
What is it?
Control minus and zoom in. Or
Control minus. No, we'll do that. Alright, look at that. It's amazing. I need a button that just says flow everything as though like I want it. Or on in demo mode. Okay, so what we can see here is that we've actually fetched just 3 stories. And we can actually look in the React DevTools to see what's happened here. So there's a little Relay tab, which is quite nice if you've used Relay. And we can actually see the query that was sent from the client to the server. And it looks a little bit strange, so don't worry too much about that. What you should worry about is this stories component. And instead of saying the first 6, it's actually said the first 3 after this big long ID. And this is Relay understanding how convention around connections. And so these fields here with edges and cursor and node, they sound like really kind of dry and graph theory-ish. But they're essentially a convention that Relay uses when you're looking at a connection or a set of objects, and then you're just viewing a subset of it. So in this case, like you might have 1,000 stories and you just want to load 3. So this is a connection. And Relay has the cursor, which is kind of an ID that tracks where you're up to. And when you want to load more, it knows what it's already seen, and the convention, which is saying after the cursor, fetch 3 more to go and get more of those things. The other convention that we have is something called page info, and has next page. And if we look in the network, we can see that we have a next page and we have a previous page. Oops, sorry, we don't have a previous page. I lied about that. And so when I click load more, the next result will actually come back and say we've exhausted this complete set. So we've actually loaded all of the items that will ever exist in this collection. And now Relay knows this. So if I click load more, it's actually never going to send another query because it knows that it's exhausted this entire connection. And so that's how query parameters work in Relay. So I want to show you mutations now. And mutations are, like I said, modifying data. I've lost my mouse. There we go. And if I click on this button here, you'll see that we're updating this count. So it's going from 7 to 8, 8 to 9, etc., etc. And this actually exists in GraphQL. And this is what mutations look like in their raw form. So this syntax is a little bit more complex than the query syntax I showed you before. It's pretty ugly again, lots of different colors, which means something scary is happening. Firstly, you have to say it's a mutation. So kind of imagine this is like saying post versus get in an HTTP request. You're specifying what you're about to do. Like this it can be called anything, so don't worry about that. But you have to specify what your input is going to be. So my input is down here where it's just an ID, but we always have to specify what type it is. Next most important thing is that we're saying what mutation we want to apply. And this is kind of like the analog of having an endpoint that you're making a request to. And then finally, we're actually getting a response from a mutation. So in this case, I'll actually show you what we have here. We have like story payload, and this is the response I'll get. And so it's telling me that a like story will always give me back something that contains a story. And so if I execute this, you'll see my count will increase because we're actually modifying it. And then I can actually like request whatever I want, really. So I can say, I want to know the type of what I just changed to. So really I can go in and write anything that would be a regular query, and that will come back. So to use this inside Relay, we have some code here, which I can't see. So we have a like button, and we're triggering this mutation via that Relay object, the Relay parameter I showed you before, and it has a method called commit update, and it's taking in an instance. If you were using Redux, this is like fairly similar to dispatching an action. This is just telling Relay to do that change. And inside the mutation, there's a lot of kind of boilerplate. Mutations are like really nasty in Relay. It's getting improved in newer versions. So don't worry too much about the syntax. We just look at the core concepts. We have the mutation. We're saying what kind of mutation it is. It's a like story. We're saying which properties, because we need to say which story we're liking. And then we say what we want to get back, because we obviously have to update the count that we're showing to the user. And then the interesting thing is the optimistic response. And so this is where we say, on the client, we say what we expect the server is going to respond with. And so this lets us update the UI before the server without having to wait for that server round trip, which is 500 milliseconds or a second. So this lets us give a really nice user experience without having to kind of like build it ourselves. And Relay is going to do all of the coercing of, or like the coordination of data. So if the server says, well, actually 10 other people liked this in the meantime, it's going to make sure that like everything ends up in a consistent state. And if I'm going to go through and show you how that works. I'm going to actually kill my GraphQL server. So kill the server now. So this is going to make sure that, yes, okay. So kill the server. So this is going to make sure that every single request we send, every single mutation is going to fail. And I'm going to spam this like button, click it a bunch of times, and we'll see the count go up. This is all the optimistic mutations taking place. So this is Relay going, okay, well, I'm going to update your UI so that it looks like you're actually doing something. Now, if I stop, there's a bunch of network requests happening in the background that are the actual mutations happening. And eventually, they're all going to fail. It's probably going to take a while, so I hit that button a bunch of times. Okay, we can see that they all failed. And now Relay is going, okay, what was the last state that was, we knew was correct and that was corresponding to what the server understood? And it's actually rolled us back to that state and we can ensure that it did it in a really consistent way. All right, so that is mutations and pagination. So I've walked you through GraphQL and GraphQL, which are two really great tools for working with GraphQL servers. Co-located queries, query composition, params, and mutations. And so essentially that's Relay. Like I said before, it is a very opinionated framework. And if you find that it works well with your application and the model that your application is kind of following, then you're going to have a great experience. But if not, you're probably going to find that it's getting in your way because it is opinionated. And there's a few rules of thumb that I've kind of like seen for when it's a good fit versus when it's not. The first is that you want the network data to be the source of truth. And a good example of this is, not surprisingly, Facebook. So you have posts, and you have likes, and you have friend requests, all of that kind of stuff. And that all lives on the server. And it's your job as an application developer to synchronize that down to your client. If you're doing something like a client application, a single page app, maybe a Canvas authoring tool, and you can do some drawing, and you have a bunch of local state, and you occasionally sync it to a server, that's actually not really a good fit for Relay. So don't use it. The second thing you need is a GraphQL API. And you probably want it to be Relay compatible to kind of get all of the benefit of doing efficient fetches. And finally, you probably want to go all in on Relay. So you might have a big Redux application or use Flux or something like that. And you go, well, I want to try Relay, but I'll do it just in this little corner of my application. And if you do that, you're probably not getting much benefit at all because Relay benefits from knowing about all of the data you've ever fetched and all of the queries that you want to run and doing that in an efficient way. If you're kind of doing it just for a subset of your application, there's zero efficiency wins, and it's just duplicating logic that you've already set up in your Redux action dispatches and stuff like that. If you kind of flip it around and have a big Relay application with a little bit of Redux on top, that works perfectly fine, and Facebook do that for some of their React native applications. Other thing I want to touch on is something called Relay Modern. So I said a couple of times, don't worry about syntax. And the reason for that is that the Relay team have just spent about 18 months completely rewriting the internals of the framework, which is great when you've just prepared a talk. Like this is April 19th, that's like 2 weeks ago. Like written on my demo code. Now you make me look bad. Did I just lose my mic? Too many gestures. That's okay. Have we got another mic?
Yeah, flick that one on.
How's that?
Give it a second, takes a while.
Hello?
There we go.
Cool. All right. So the reason that they do this, I'll expand on into a little. I'll expand on it in a little bit. But essentially, they've rewritten the internals. Some of the APIs have changed, but what they've introduced is a compatibility layer. So this means that any of the code I've shown you today, even though it's following the old APIs, it will work with the new internals, which is a really nice thing to have. You can have incremental upgrade without having to kind of go, well, do I want the nice new features or do I want to have to rewrite my application? Because that's a trade-off that no one really wants to make. And so the reasons for the rewrite were kind of interesting. Firstly, the core before was like a kind of monolithic whole. So everything was coupled together in one giant application. And they broke that apart into 3 main parts. So the Relay runtime is just like a JavaScript module that understands GraphQL queries and will synchronize with the server, do all of that kind of stuff, does nothing else. The Relay React integration lets you do those co-located queries, and then we'll talk to the Relay runtime. And so this is introducing kind of the complexity of the examples that I've shown you today. And the final bit is the Relay compiler, which is, when I showed you the Babel transformed code before, that was happening via a compiler. And so they've kind of beefed this up, made it do some really interesting things, like if you request the same field multiple times, it'll kind of collapse those down. If you have like unnecessary nesting, it'll remove all of that too, so it can optimize your queries ahead of time. And essentially, they wanted it to be less magical, so less kind of like, why is Relay doing that? It's kind of cool, but I'm confused, and more predictable. And it makes the framework easier to modify or extend. Because Relay React, or React Relay, that's very confusing, is just one part of this kind of triad of components. Now, if you wanted to replace that with something like an Angular Relay integration, you could potentially go and do that, and then you could have Relay in your Angular application, which is really cool. The final reason for this rewrite was that they wanted to introduce a bunch of optimizations for mobile code. So the Relay team care a lot about things like React Native, which we'll be hearing about later today, which is awesome. And in React Native, you really want to feel like you're interacting with an application built in iOS, Objective-C, or Android, or Java code. And so you need really fast startups. And so they introduced a bunch of optimizations that are actually based around not what happens at runtime, but what happens ahead of time. And so the query compiler, the Relay compiler, will do all of those optimizations on the query you've defined. We'll actually extract them, and now you have a list of every single query that you're ever going to send from your application, and they'll be optimized. Then the persistent queries is pretty cool too. So that's where you take all of those queries that we've extracted, every single query that will ever be sent from your application, and it will tell GraphQL about them ahead of time. And GraphQL will give each of those an ID, and then it will tell Relay about those IDs. So when you're starting up your application on the client, it will just, instead of sending the giant text query that I showed you before, it'll actually just send the ID up. And then you'll get the response back as though you'd actually sent the full query. And that might seem like a micro-optimization, but you save a bunch of work. So firstly, the client doesn't need to serialize and do a bunch of string concatenation to generate the query. The server doesn't need to parse it and generate an AST. So you save all of that work. It's also really important for mobile devices. So if you consider being on a 2G or a 3G network connection, your upload bandwidth is much lower than what you have for a download bandwidth. So by doing IDs instead of like these big text queries, you can like maybe even send a request for a query in like a single packet, which is pretty cool. The final optimization is exclusive to React Native. And this is where, because we already know the ID of the query that we're going to execute when everything starts up, this is actually kicked off before JavaScript has done anything. So in a React Native application, you have some Objective-C code that's application code. And then that will start a JavaScript context, and that will start your Relay application, and that will finally send you a network fetch. And so prefetching is moving that first network fetch out of JavaScript and into native code, so that when your JavaScript is ready to go, all of the data has been prefetched. And this can actually save like multiple seconds on a slow connection after your application startup. Cool. So that is Relay. And I personally think that the way it does data fetching is pretty awesome. It's different from how I've been doing this before. Like I was using XHR and all of the Ajax kind of stuff that we were doing 5 years ago. But with Relay, it was like, this is cool because it's doing all of the things that I want it to do. It's managing data normalization. It's managing my fetches. It's managing failover and what happens when a network request fails. And I've got some resources if you are interested in learning more. So the first link here is the code from this talk, so you can actually go run and install and play with that at home. The Star Wars API, if you are not sure which of the 6 Star Wars movies they visited, whatever planet, you can query that. Zero to GraphQL in 30 minutes is a really great talk by a guy called Steve Lucia, and he actually sets up not one but 3 different GraphQL servers in the 30 minutes, and he's great at live coding, which is a skill that I admire greatly. So if you think that it's hard to set up a GraphQL server, and that's the reason you shouldn't use something like Relay, this will show you that it only takes 10 minutes. And finally, we have the modern Relay overview. So this is looking at some of the kind of like the nitty-gritty and the low-level details of what has changed in the terms. All right, thank you very much for listening. Do you have time for questions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Does anyone have any questions?
Just wondering, is the client fetching the data only, or can the server push data live to an interface?
Is it working? Is that mic working? I can just shout really
No,
loud.
it's fine.
Okay.
Grab that.
So GraphQL does have subscriptions, and it is built into Relay, but it's a little bit like edge casey, and it's not like live queries where whatever you fetch will just stream down to you. It's more like you explicitly say what you care about. So what you might
So
do.
those likes, if someone else liked a
Yes.
post, it would
Yes,
update.
so what you have to do in your application is you'd say, I care about all of the likes on story 1, 2, 3, and GraphQL and Relay will make sure you're made aware of that. But it won't say, like, it's not like polling, where it'll just give you back everything you might have ever fetched, because like it's a little bit too detailed for this, but like in many applications, that's far too complex to set up. You can't say, knowing the number of people who likes 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, you can't trace through all of the possible things you need to calculate to do that. Like you really need that to be built into the backend layer, which no language today really does, unless everything's built on observables and Netflix. Like that's the only company I can think of doing that kind of stuff.
Sorry if I missed it during the talk, but I'm wondering how do I control, like, if I say these buttons, like display this data, how do I control when it's actually going to be updated? Like if I fetched 1, 2, 3, and then I added 6, 4, 5, 4, 5, 6, and what if number 1 has been updated like a second ago? How can I force update this data?
Yeah, so it sounds like you're
How is
talking.
it being managed at all? Like, what's the philosophy?
So there is a brute force method where you can say like invalidate all of the caches, and then it will just go and refetch the thing you're currently looking at, and that'll take into account all of the params and the variables that you've set. So it'll be basically like doing a command F5 and reloading all of the data that you have. So that's the brute force method. The non-brute force method. Brute force method is the subscriptions model, where you're saying, I care about all story likes for these set of IDs, and then you can actually, I haven't done this for a while, but you say like, it'll give you some data and it'll know how to apply that to your normalized data that you have locally cached. The thing I didn't really mention is that with the locally normalized data, whenever you mutate that, like whenever anything updates that, everything that is showing that data will be automatically updated. So Relay will automatically handle subscriptions from your local cache. And then the question of how you get data from the server to your local cache, there's a few different ways. There's the brute force method, you just reload everything. There's the subscription method where you say, okay, I care about these events. And then I believe there's a few more. I think with the new Relay Modern, it's like, it's up to you. You could implement whatever you want. If you want to use WebSockets, you will just get a payload and you'll apply that to your local cache, and then Relay will handle, informing every single React component that cares about that data.
You mentioned API versioning at the start. What sort of stuff is involved to actually support that in your app, or what does that
You
look like?
never remove a field, and then you're done. Yeah, so it's interesting actually. So like Facebook has been using GraphQL for like about 5 years now, and they basically do this. Once you roll something out, you never remove it. If you want to introduce something that's semantically different, like a title, you want to go from plain text into HTML or XML format, you'll just introduce a new field which has a different name. You might say like title _ XML, and you'll start using that instead. But like you can't ever assume like an old application has gone away, and you can't just switch the formats because it's like you're going to break an application that's out there, because people never ever update their apps.
All right, thanks, Josh.
Yeah.
Great. Let's just noticing your underscore syntax when you were naming your data variables.
Yep.
Can you say anything about that? Is that like Facebook standard or?
The underscore variables.
You
Which one
have
is
like
that?
a story underscore
With the introspection.
the JSX.
What did I do? Which component was this?
So like story underscore underscore.
Oh, this is like, this is not how I write CSS. Was this in the CSS, the class name?
I'm not sure if it was only in the CSS. It looked like you were using a similar thing in the actual name of your data variables. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. Okay,
Yeah,
so it's class name.
pay more attention. Yeah, so I was using feed underscore underscore next. It's ugly, isn't it? This is like, I don't know, does anyone do BEM? I think this is BEM, right?
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah, I figured like for purposes of this, I wouldn't use inline CSS or some kind of esoteric CSS in JavaScript system. I just use what we knew. So, but obviously that was a poor choice.
Because I just know that in databases they often use like lowercase with underscores for the data variables, but then when you put it into JavaScript, they often translate.
Yeah, none of that magic.
Transcode.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I think Ruby does a lot of that kind of stuff. No, this is not magic. This is what you see is what you get there with those class names.
Okay.
Hey, good talk. Really
Thanks.
interesting. I had a question about GraphQL mutation and if there's best practice. So I'm wondering, you imagine you're going to have, without GraphQL mutation, you've got somewhere where you put a bunch of business logic to validate that the request for mutation is valid. So when we move to a model of having the mutations supported in GraphQL, are we advocating, or is there any like literature on should I take that business logic and put it into the GraphQL server, or would that exist on a tier below?
No, the GraphQL server should understand the business logic because it should reject anything. And this is like, because this is an endpoint, right? So anyone can hit it with anything. So you need to make sure that it's doing the appropriate validation. Like think of it literally as a post endpoint. It's like you're not going to accept a parameter and go, oh, cool, your user ID 0. I'm going to write some variables for you. You're going to do some validation on that.
Well, I just think that the GraphQL server, because it needs to know what everything in terms of the connections between different entities, it starts to become larger and larger. But then if you have all that business logic collected into it, seems like it's encouraging the development of monoliths.
Yeah, so if you're doing a lot of validation and a lot of logic, you can have a microservice, but it would be the client talks to GraphQL, and GraphQL will talk to the appropriate backends to validate what's being sent. And which makes sense, like it should be a thin layer. GraphQL is not magical. Like once you've actually written one, and you can actually go and check out the code for this. I've actually got some code here I can show you real quick, maybe. See data anywhere here? Whoops. We've got data schema.js, I think that's it. There's a lot of imports, and then you're just going, here you're going, okay, when someone wants to fetch a user for the name, oh no, that's a bad example. What about resolve? Okay, cool. So you're saying for a feed, when they fetch the stories, go and run this function and return a value, and that's it. Like GraphQL is not magical at all. The only kind of reason this is so ugly to read is because you're defining schema at the same time as you're defining the way that you resolve that schema. But like this is literally the meat of it, right? You're saying when they want to get a stories, you go and get something from somewhere else and you return it. That's literally it. So like you can do whatever validation from whatever other microservices, and that's not so scary. Cool. All the questions? All right. Do we have time for this, or?
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Can I use GraphQL with any type of database, like NoSQL or?
Yeah. So it'll work with any database. Literally, you'll have, and the way it worked at Facebook was that there were a bunch of data fetching like internal objects that would just, like you say, like get the user 1, 2, 3, and GraphQL was taking advantage of all of those things already existing and putting a nice interface in front of it. And so like at Facebook, it's GraphQL talking to the internal PHP libraries which do data fetching, and so like they already existed. They knew how to fetch like related data and all that kind of stuff. So like one of the explicit intentions was that it should expose all of this data in a structured way without forcing you to rewrite your application. Like Facebook hates to throw away code. There's like tens of millions of lines, and like stopping and rewriting all of your data fetching is just not acceptable.
Can you give a brief overview on errors, so server errors, and I think you showed like a client error handle where it would just switch back, but what about server-side errors? How does that work?
Yeah. That is a great question, and I wish I'd included it in this talk. I think I did include it in the draft, and it got lost. That's helpful. So the way that GraphQL handles errors is to essentially treat it as you can't see something. So what you don't want to have happen is that it cascades up and a story missing causes your entire request to fail, right? Because it's often it's not consequential to what you're trying to do. And a good way to kind of think of it is on the continuum of things are normal to things are broken, this is an error, is Facebook something that's really important to them is privacy. So what happens if you have a story or a comment you can't see? Is that different from having the database failed and it's not visible? It's kind of if you squint, they kind of look like the same thing. So what GraphQL will do, well, at least in Facebook's implementation, is say if you can't see something, it's just you don't return it. It doesn't exist in that collection, or that field is null. And so it's just maybe you could introduce some conventions in your GraphQL schema that say, here's how you define an exception. A non-exception error. I think there is things in GraphQL, if you have a 500 error, and it will report that back, because that's the server fell over, and you can't really recover from that. But if it's something minor, we tried to read a file off disk and it failed, but we want to kind of push forward, you just kind of go, well, we'll get past that and continue on. What GraphQL did introduce recently, and was probably one of their big design failings, was the idea of required fields. And so they should have made fields required by default. And that would have allowed errors to cascade upwards. And that lets the client, this is getting a little bit too into the weeds here, but this lets the client say how much they care about things. So if you say that let's say that we're looking at a user object, and you're saying if that user doesn't have a name, might be because you can't see it because of privacy or because of an error or something like that, you can say, well, that's a required field, and then the entire user object will be missing. And if you say the user on a feed story is required, then that entire feed story will go missing too. So that means you don't end up with kind of partial objects. By declaring that this is a field is required and its children are also required, you can kind of force the error to kind of cascade up to the level that you care about. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's kind of the nice thing about it is that you don't want to have your entire application failed because some inconsequential thing didn't work as expected. If you want to be robust, it's you kind of render with what you've got.
Awesome. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.